So the title of the talk tonight is What Happens When We Die? Speculative Possibilities in Fiction. So in the first four talks, I've been looking specifically at Buddhist notions of rebirth or rebecoming. But in the final two talks of this series, I'm going to broaden the scope beyond rebirth to ask more generally, what might happen when we die? The scientist and philosopher Ian McGilchrist believes that to better understand ourselves and our place in the world, to deal with subjects like what happens when we die, we need to use science, reason, intuition, and imagination. And in this talk this evening, I'm very much turning to the realm of imagination. I'm going to look at three particular examples of writers imagining in fiction what might happen if our consciousness in some sense continues after the death of the physical body. And next week in the final talk, I'll be looking at what some scientists and philosophers have to say about the nature of mind and consciousness and how that relates to what might happen when we die. But before I start the examples from fiction I'm going to use this evening, I must give what is called a spoiler alert, because unavoidably I'm going to be giving away some really important plot details. So I can't ask you to close your ears because you'll miss the talk. So unfortunately, I'm going to give some important plot details away. So my first example in fiction is from Philip Pullman, author of the trilogy His Dark Materials, which I think some of you will be familiar with. And in the final book of the trilogy, The Amber Spyglass, the two main characters, Lyra and Will, are leading the dead out of an underground hell into the open air to be released from their imprisonment. And the dead ask, what will happen to us when we're in the open? And Lyra replies, this is what will happen, she said. When you go out of here, all the particles that make you up will loosen and float apart, just like your demons did. Now, for those of you not familiar with the Dark Materials trilogy, Philip Pullman's demon is the external physical manifestation of a person's inner self that takes the form of an animal. It's a very positive thing. So Lyra goes on, but your demons are not nothing now. They're part of everything. All the atoms that were then, they've gone into the air and the wind and the trees and the earth and all the living things. They'll never vanish. They're just part of everything. And one of the dead responds to what Lyra says with these words. But now this child has come offering us a way out, and I'm going to follow her. Even if it means oblivion, friends, I'll welcome it, because it won't be nothing. We'll be alive again in 1,000 blades of grass and 1,000,000 leaves. We'll be falling in the raindrops and blowing in the fresh breeze. We'll be glittering in the dew under the stars and the moon out there in the physical world, which is our true home and always was. And Pullman writes, the first ghost to leave the world of the dead was Roger. He took a step forward and turned to look back at Lyra and laughed in surprise as he found himself turning into the night, the starlight, the air, and then he was gone, leaving behind such a vivid little burst of happiness that Will was reminded of the bubbles in a glass of champagne. Now, when I first read that, I was incredibly moved and inspired. And it's interesting that another friend of mine, who's a very long-standing friend of mine and an order member, he found it very nihilistic. The opposite reaction to me. I found it incredibly inspiring. But you maybe can just take time to reflect on what your own responses to that description might be. Now I'm going to move to two authors who come from backgrounds of working with the brain. One, a man called Paul Broks, who worked in neuropsychology, working with people whose brains have been damaged in some ways. And another, David Eagleman, who worked as a neuroscientist. So you might have come across David Eagleman. He's the author of a book that I'm going to be quoting from called Some 40 Tales from the Afterlives. Have any of you read this book? Yeah, one person at least. That's good. And I'll be doing some examples from that book in the talk. So David Eagleman is a neuroscientist. He did a TV series called The Brain with David Eagleman, and he's written a book called The Brain, The Story of You. And to the question, is there an afterlife? David Eagleman answers, who knows? And this leads him to describe himself as a possibillion. Now, Paul Broks is a neuropsychologist and is the author of a book called Into the Silent Land, a collection of non-fiction and fictional stories. It's not clear exactly what his stance is on consciousness and the afterlife, but in one of his fictional stories, he describes himself as a Mysterian. Now, a Mysterian is someone who considers that understanding consciousness is beyond the power of the human mind and must therefore remain a mystery. And the name Mysterian is taken from a 1960s American rock band called Question Mark and the Mysterians, who are seen as one of the earliest examples of punk rock. So people who call themselves Mysterians, they're very serious, but I like it that they've taken their name from one of the first punk rock bands. So we have a possibillion and a Mysterian. And the stories they tell contain insights and are a lot of fun. So I'm going to deal with the Mysterian first, Paul Broks. And this is a story that you wrote, a fictional story called To Be Two or Not to Be. And the story takes place in a future world where teleportation around the planets is commonplace. And I'm told that it's a fictional story that has a basis in a piece of writing by the philosopher Derek Parfit. So with teleportation, you step into a booth, then you step out a few moments later somewhere else across the solar system. So teleportation is speed of light swift, being completed in a matter of moments. What travels between the transceivers is not a stream of atoms, but a stream of data. The controller in this story, a former philosopher called Derek, pushes the green button and the scanners plot the exact coordinates of every atom in your body, including your conscious and unconscious mind. The information is encoded and transmitted from one end and received and decoded at the other, where the process of reconstruction takes place using locally available material. Now, one other very important detail. Once the atomic coordinates have been plotted and transmitted, The body at this end is instantly and painlessly annihilated. This annihilation must be carried out in this way by order of what's called the Subcommittee on Personal Identity. Two versions of you cannot exist at the same time, even momentarily. So the author of this story is taking his 13th teleportation trip. But this time, when the door slides open, the author realizes he's still in the same place. So he speaks to the controller. "Problems, Derek?" he said. Derek swears. The equipment had malfunctioned, but only partially. The author was scanned and dispatched, but not vaporized at the point of departure. But at the other end, meanwhile, his replica is assembled and is now fulfilling the author's duties on Mars, contacting his family as usual to tell them of his safe arrival. And because of this exceptional event, the author is informed, the Subcommittee on Personal Identity is going to be meeting in emergency session to decide what should be done. So the author is placed in locked isolation and is not able to contact his wife or any other members of his family or friends or colleagues. They're being contacted by his other identity on Mars. So late at night, Derek, the philosopher turned teleportation controller, breaks the rules and enters the author's locked room. He explains that the subcommittee is considering the problem. Given the unfortunate turn of events, they are now debating whether to allow the author and his replica to continue to exist in parallel and thereby contravene the Proliferation of Persons Act, or to have one of them, even at this late stage, vaporized, to be two or not to be. The author continues, "I told Derek, I don't want to die." Derek replies, "It wouldn't be the end of the world," which strikes me as a very odd thing to say, writes the author. Derek sat in the easy chair at the far end of the room, still in shadow. "What's the difference?" he said. "Suppose it had gone according to plan. You would have stepped into the booth, the scanners would have done their stuff, your body would have been zapped to zero, and your replica would have appeared on Mars, walking your walk and talking your talk. And that is what has happened. That is what always happens, except this time the zapping may have been a little delayed." The difference, the author says to Derek, I might have said, is that I'm still here now. And having had time to reflect, I don't think I want to be zapped to zero, even though 12 times before, this is precisely what has happened. "It's fine for you, Derek," I said, "to deny the importance of personal identity and pontificate on the conceptual confusion of anyone else on the planet who happens to believe otherwise, but put yourself in my position. There is a distinct possibility that I'm about to be snuffed out. Right now, my concerns about whether I shall still be here by the weekend or zapped to zero, as you indelicately put it, seem real enough. And if I am to be vaporized, I'm sure you'll have no difficulty giving a determinate answer to the question of whether I exist or not." And Derek replies, and this is where it connects with the talks I've been giving earlier. "Let me put it this way," Derek says. "Even though it involves destruction of the body and reconstruction using entirely new materials, we should think of traveling by teleportation as no more threatening or problematic than traveling on life's journey from one day to the next. What matters in both cases, in terms of what is preserved, is precisely the same, that psychological continuity. We are the same from one day to the next only insofar as the bundle of mental states, actual and potential, that our brain takes with it to sleep at night resembles the bundle that it wakes up with in the morning. You survive from one day to the next because the psychological links have been maintained. So not surprisingly, the author's not persuaded by that argument. He wants to cling to this life, this awareness of the present moment. And the story ends with the author being called to the meeting of the subcommittee on personal identity. We don't know what happens, but we might guess it won't be a good outcome for the author. So that's Paul Brock's. I really recommend his book, Into the Silent Land. It's full of some really interesting stories of his accounts of dealing with patients with brain damage, very funny, very moving, and fictional stories, which are really interesting and take up interesting themes like that theme there. So now on to David Eagleman and his book, Some. So the idea with David Eagleman's book, Some, was to write 40 mutually exclusive stories where each story tells a completely different, incompatible version of the afterlife. And I think that each story, although it's about the afterlife, tells us something interesting about ourselves in the life we are living right now. So I'm going to share some of the alternatives with you. So, first alternative. In the afterlife, in this version, you relive all of your life experiences, but this time with the events shuffled into a new order. All the moments that share a particular quality are grouped together. So you spend 2 months driving the street in front of your house, 7 months having sex. You sleep for 30 years without opening your eyes. And for 5 months straight, you flip through magazines while sitting on a toilet. 4 minutes wondering what your life would be like if you reshuffled the order of events. So in this part of the afterlife, you imagine something analogous to your earthly life, and the thought is blissful. A life where episodes are split into tiny, swallowable pieces, where moments do not endure, where one experiences the joy of jumping from one event to the next, like a child hopping from spot to spot on the burning sand. Now, rereading that story, I was reminded of 2 poems, which you may be familiar with, on impermanence. First, an extract from a poem by Tsongkhapa, which I think we use a lot in Triratna, and it goes like this. All worldly things are brief, like lightning in the sky. This life you must know as the tiny splash of a raindrop, a thing of beauty that disappears even as it comes into being. And the second poem I was reminded of was by Robert Burns, a poem called Tam O'Shanter, and this is an extract from Tam O'Shanter. You seize the flower, its bloom is shed, or like the snow falls in the river, a moment white, then melts forever. Or like the borealis race that flit ere you can point their place. or like the rainbow's lovely form, evanishing amid the storm. I really like putting Sonkerpa together with Robbie Burns. Something about, they're both brilliant on impermanence and the value, the joy we can take from experiencing impermanence. So second short story on the afterlife from David Eagleman. So in this story, God has a great idea in keeping with her generous spirit. She's going to grant everyone, every last human, a place in heaven. And the most important aspect of her new system is that everyone is treated equally. There is no longer fire for some and harp music for others. Everyone is a brother to all. And for the first time, an idea has been realized that never came to fruition on earth: true equality. But does this mean everyone is happy? The communists are baffled and irritated because they have finally achieved their perfect society, but only by the help of a God in whom they don't want to believe. The meritocrats are abashed that they're stuck for eternity in an incentiveless system with a bunch of pinkos. The conservatives have no penniless to disparage, and the liberals have no downtrodden to promote. So God sits on the edge of her bed and weeps at night, because the only thing everyone can agree upon is that they're all in hell. Now, it's a very funny story, but of course, actually, there's a very interesting Buddhist perspective on that. And I think it's this: what you're seeing is the power of people's sanskaras passing from one life to the next. They can't let go of their fixed view sanskaras. And that means they turn heaven, the conditions of heaven, into hell. Their mind turns heaven into hell because of the power of their sanskaras. Anyway, that's my interpretation of it. So, third version. Wait a sec. Yeah, no, that's okay. Third version. In this alternative afterlife, when you arrive, you're split into your multiple selves at all possible ages who remain the same age forever. This means that the different yous might run into each other at the grocery store like separate people do on Earth. Your 76-year-old self may revisit his favorite stream and run into his 11-year-old self. Your 28-year-old self may break up with a lover in a restaurant and notice your 35-year-old self visiting that spot, lingering on the air of regret hanging over the empty seat. And Eagleman writes, typically the different yous are happy to see each other because they possess the same name and a shared history. But the yous are more critical of yourselves than they are of others. And so each you quickly identifies habits that get under your skin. So it's a fact of afterlife. Don't be surprised to discover that after decomposition into your different ages, the different yous tend to drift apart, and you discover that the you of 8 years old has less in common than expected with the you of 32 and the you of 64. The 18-year-old you finds more in common with other 18-year-olds than with your 73-year-old you. And the 73-year-old you doesn't mind that a bit, seeking out meaningful conversations with others of the same generation. Beyond the name, the yous have little else in common. Though once in a while, the different yous organize a gathering, like a family reunion, bringing together all your ages into a single room. And at these reunions, the middle-aged will delightedly pinch the cheeks of the young, and the teenagers will politely listen to the stories and advice of the elderly. But these reunions reveal a group of individuals touchingly searching for a common theme. They appeal to your name as a unifying structure, but they come to realize that the name that existed on earth, the you that moved serially through these different identities, was like a bundle of sticks from different trees. They come to understand with awe the complexity of the compound identity that existed on the earth. They conclude with a shudder that the earthly you is utterly lost, unpreserved in the afterlife. You were all these ages, they concede, and you were none. So things to reflect on there. How do you connect with your earlier life selves? So, on to the final example. At death, the atoms that made up your body begin to drift apart, no longer enslaved to the goals of keeping up a human form. The interacting pieces that once constructed your body begin to unravel, each piece spiraling off in a different direction. Following your last breath, those 1,000 trillion atoms begin to blend into the earth around you. And as you degrade, your atoms become incorporated into new constellations. Maybe, Eagleman writes, the leaf of a staghorn fern, maybe a speckled snail shell, a kernel of maize, a beetle's mandible, the tail feather of a ptarmigan. But it turns out that your 1,000 trillion atoms were not an accidental collection. Each was labeled as comprising you and continues to be so wherever it goes. So you are not gone. You're simply taking on different forms. Instead of your gestures being the raising of an eyebrow or a blown kiss, now a gesture might consist of a waving stalk of wheat or the inhaling lung of a breaching beluga whale. Your manner of expressing joy might become a sheet of seaweed playing on a wave, or it could be a pendulous funnel dancing for a cumulonimbus cloud, or it could be a glossy river pebble gliding around an eddy. And Eagleman writes, from your present clumped point of view, this afterlife may sound unnervingly distributed, but in fact, he says, it is wonderful. You can't imagine the pleasure of stretching your redefined body across vast territories, ruffling your grasses and bending your pine branch and flexing your wings while pushing a crab towards the surface through coruscating shafts of light. For once every few millennia, all of your atoms pull together again, traveling from around the globe, like the leaders of nations uniting for a summit, converging for their densest reunion in the form of a human. The reunion is warm and heartening for a while, but it isn't long before they begin to miss their freedom. And in this form, they find themselves longing to ascend mountains, wander the seas and conquer the air, seeking to recapture the limitlessness they once knew. And that reminded me of a poem that I'd already chosen to be read during the meditation at the end of the evening today. And I'm going to finish with this poem. It's by Mary Elizabeth Fry. And the title of the poem is "Do Not Stand at My Grave and Weep." Do not stand at my grave and weep. I am not there. I do not sleep. I am 1,000 winds that blow. I am the diamond glints on snow. I am the sunlight on ripened grain. I am the gentle autumn rain. When you awaken in the morning's hush, I am the swift, uplifting rush of quiet birds in circled flight. I am the soft stars that shine at night. Do not stand at my grave and cry, I am not there. I did not die. So there's a lot of food for thought, I think, in those stories. And you might want in the groups to sort of reflect upon them. But also you might want to recall things you've read yourself in fiction that relate to the afterlife and this life. You might want to bring that into the discussions and maybe just to talk about your responses to those stories that I shared with you. In some ways, I feel a bit of a cheat because I didn't write the talk tonight. I put it together. Other people wrote the talk. But I wanted to share with you what I find inspiring about other people's writing as it relates, importantly, to the question of the afterlife and how we live this life. Good.
Do you want to, have you got time for a question or
Yes,
comment from
yes,
You've got 5 or 10 minutes maybe?
Yeah.
Any
That's
comments,
good.
questions?
Yeah. Have any of you read Paul Brox's book Into the Silent Land or heard of it?
I'll say one thing with that.
Yeah.
Have you seen a film called The Prestige?
Called the
Prestige.
No.
Okay. If you like that story, you'll like The Prestige.
Yes. Okay, good. Share that with the group. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure that there are lots of other examples that people could think of. So I could think of well, obviously Groundhog Day as a film, and a Warren Beatty film, Heaven Can Wait, and various other examples in films and so on. And there's lots of stuff around. And what I find interesting about all of these things is how they reflect upon the lives that we live now. There's a message in there if you watch them and listen carefully and read carefully. Something inspiring there. Yes.
Just thinking how often in the writings, I wonder if the author is kind of writing to the people that are left behind to give them comfort, as opposed to the bit of the human that dies or the afterlife. Because I was thinking about how much of death impacts those who are alive, really.
Yes.
As opposed to death itself, the dying process and the loss for others. And I thought some of the authors offer some comfort in some way, perhaps for those that are left behind, really.
Yeah.
Feel left behind.
Particularly that last poem by Mary Elizabeth Fry, which is, I think, is a beautiful, beautiful poem. And actually, there's quite a lot of poets have written on a similar sort of theme about that kind of thing. That do not grieve for me, do not stand at my grave and cry, and so on. because I'm still here in some form. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Do you find it difficult to leave out some other stories? And I'm thinking of one, I may just try and re-quote it. Everybody knows the puja, the piece of the puja where the sevenfold puja, where it says, may I become like the earth is serviceable in many ways, the
Yes.
infinite number of beings,
Yes.
etc. I can't actually
Yeah. What do you
don't
mean?
go on further, but it seems to suggest that what I'm requesting is to become just like the earth, serviceable in many ways.
Yes. Well, you can take it metaphorically or literally or however you wish to take it. Yeah. Actually, there is an echo of that there, isn't there? Yes, Lee.
Yeah, great talk. Thanks, Vaddhaka. I found the part you were speaking about the different ages meet each other really quite kind of powerful image. Would you kind of say personally from your own experience that as you have got older, your kind of fear of non-existence has changed or diminished?
Yes and no. I think when I look at no stage in my earlier life could I ever have predicted what I would become. That's clear to me. I mean, things have happened that I became things that I just had no idea were conceivable in my life at all. That's one side of it. On the other side is that I can see, I think, hints at different times of something else trying to come through, and feeling that I'm closer to whatever that is now than I have been at any point in my life. So that I do feel that there's some kind of continuous prompting being going on right the way through. There's this form of continuity, if you like. So, for example, I realized, a year or two after I became involved in Buddhism in my late 40s for the first time, I knew nothing about Buddhism, or so I thought before I found Buddhism. And then realizing actually there were several occasions earlier in my life when I'd been given a big shove towards Buddhism and I'd missed it. I'd missed it completely. The classic example being, because I was politically very involved, one of my favorite books is a book, I'm trying to remember the author's name now. It's called But the Dead Are Many. And he's an Australian who was he wrote TV plays and series and so on. And he was very active in the Australian Communist Party. And the story, But the Dead Are Many, was about the Moscow trials in the 1930s, when Stalin basically had executed all those people who stood in his way and millions of others as well. And the links to the life inside the Communist Party in Australia in the 1950s and 1960s. Really moving book. But I had forgotten that at the front of that book was a story which he put, Frank Hardy was his name. He put this story before the book about politics. And the story was the story of Kisa Gotami. Kisa Gotami and the mustard seed. And of course, the phrase, but the dead are many, is there in the story of Kisa Gotami. So he took the title of that book from that story about Kisa Gotami. And there were other hints. And it's only much later on that I realized what that was. And by that time, I'd lost that book, Frank Hardy's book, but I remembered it. And when I was in Sydney in 2016, I went to this incredible secondhand bookshop, not that far from the Sydney Buddhist Centre, one of the best, massive secondhand bookshop. And I found not the exact same copy, but the same edition, the same front. I bought it, of course, and I've got it. But the Dead Are Many. And it's there. And I realized that I was given a big push and I missed it. But later in life, I remembered it. So those things are there, something's there. But I couldn't have conceived where I'd end up now.
We've probably got time for one more question or comment, if anyone's got anything they want to ask Vaddhaka.
You had to save one of those stories from the waves. You're on a desert island, and which is your favourite of those? Which sort of moves you the most of those stories that you've read to us?
Well, the one that had the biggest impact was where God sends everyone to heaven. Reading about, because I come from a political background, I could understand it exactly. I mean, it's actually such a powerful story about how, you can be given all the conditions of heaven, but your sanskaras are such that you cannot let go of this view that it should not be this way.
And what are your sanskaras?
What are my
No,
sanskaras?
not yours. What does that mean?
Okay, it means
you're not
that
used to that language.
these motivations, the powerful karmic dispositions that you have in this life, so that people, would have a karmic disposition towards a particular view that they hold on to very strongly. So if you're communist, you want equality for all, but you're an atheist, you cannot believe in God. So there you are, you're stuck with this paradox. Everybody's equal, but you don't believe in God. You can't let go of clinging to the view that equality for all can only come about through revolution. But instead, this blooming God has given it to everybody. So you're stuck like that and you can't let go of it. That's a sanskara. And of course, it's what we talk about. This is what the Buddha teaches. What carries forward from one life to another rebecoming is sanskaras, these powerful karmic dispositions that we carry, which can be positive or negative. In this case, he's pointing out about clinging to fixed views is a really, really powerful sanskara. There's actually another book which I didn't refer to in the talks called The Brief History of the Dead, which is based upon the idea that when people die, they go to a world which is kind of like this world, and they stay there, and the features of this world, and they stay there as long as there is someone alive who particularly directly remembers them. Not that they've read about them, but who knew them, who remembers them. And when there's no longer anybody left who remembers them, they just disappear from that world. Where they go to, no one knows. And there's basically what you see is how people hold onto their views from their previous life and find it very, very hard to let go of them in this new life, in this afterlife. And that's I mean, if going back to the question I was asked, I think one of the things is that I've learned that a lot of my views have changed, but I know that there are some sanskaras there which are really, really strong. But still, I think I've overcome them. But then suddenly, boom, something happens and they come banging through very powerfully. So, you don't let go of them easily.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks for all the questions and comments. Thank you, Vaddhaka, for a very thought-provoking, playful talk. I really like this talk.
Yeah.
Playful.
Yeah.
So we'll need to break for a tea break now. So we just give Vaddhaka a round of applause again. We'll break.